This morning we are gathering to talk about joy. And as I think about joy, it's not difficult at Christmas time for us to think thoughts of joy as we think about this season. And we reminisce about the screams and laughter of children opening gifts. We think about the music that we hear that brings joy to our hearts and our minds. And we think about gatherings, both family and of friends. A lot of this gives great feelings of happiness too. And that's a good thing. But today we're talking about joy, which is something different from happiness. For most of us, nothing produces joy like the thought of being home. And as we move through this season of Advent, that's the promise that produces joy in those who've received that promise that is given in the birth of Jesus. That's what the prophet Zephaniah was talking about to the Israelites thousands of years ago. Now keep in mind that the Israelites were in a moment of, shall we say, accountability for their sins. And were actually living in captivity away from home. Listen to these words from the 3rd chapter of the book of Zephaniah, beginning with the 14th verse. Sing, daughter Zion. Shout aloud, Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all your heart, daughter Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away your punishment. He has turned back your enemy. The Lord, the King of Israel, is with you. Never again will you fear any harm. On that day, they will say to Jerusalem, do not fear, Zion. Do not let your hands hang limp. The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves. He will take great delight in you. In his love, he will no longer rebuke you, but will rejoice over you with singing. I will remove from you all who mourn over the loss of your appointed festivals, which is a burden and a reproach for you. At that time, I will deal with all who oppressed you. I will rescue the lame. I will gather the exiles. I will give them praise and honor in every land where they have suffered shame. At that time, I will gather you. At that time, I will bring you home. I will give you honor and praise among all the peoples of the earth when I restore your fortunes before your very eyes, says the Lord. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Won't you pray with me? Lord, as we enter these moments, we pray that you would speak, that you would use the words that come out of my mouth and the things that all of us are thinking about in these next few moments to bring us to the place that you would have us be, to help us see ourselves at home with you. We offer this moment to you in the precious name of your Son, Jesus, and all God's children said. Amen. So we're talking about joy. And as we listen to those words from Zephaniah, I think it's interesting to me that, again, you don't hear the word joy in the passage we read. But I want you to get the context, because it's always kind of a clue as to what's going on. So just in this chapter of Zephaniah alone, in the very first part of it, Zephaniah is talking about Israel's rebelliousness, what got them into the position they were in. And they were consistently not doing what God was asking them to do. And so that's the first part of Zephaniah. And then the next few verses, Zephaniah talks about Israel's intentional unrepentantness. In other words, even after understanding what they had done, they were intentional about not turning back to God. And so, in the midst of all that is where we find these next passages. And for the remainder of the book of Zephaniah, from the 9th verse on to the end, in a way, and sometimes it's hard to see, but in a way, Zephaniah is talking about the restoration of the remnant of Israel. And just so you know what the remnant is a term that we use when we talk about those of the Israelite nation who heard God's voice and received God's reprimand and turned from their ways and turned back to God. And so even in the midst of this moment where the Israelites had been so unrepentant and so disobedient to God, there was a group of them that were still devoted to God. And their faithfulness led to this whole last part of this chapter in Zephaniah. God restored them and let that remnant go home to Israel. God gave them something that brought joy, even in the midst of what the rest of the Israelites were dealing with, which was their own choosing. God restored this remnant. So, now don't be confused, because we're not talking about happy. We're not talking about happiness. These folks went home, but their home was destroyed. So what they went home to was a shambles. In this moment, as we think about those folks in the Midwest that are dealing with this tornado, that's something that they can identify with. They may have a sense of joy in that they exited that moment with their lives, but as they walk back to their houses, to their homes, in many cases, there's nothing left. And that's what this remnant was going home to. So it wasn't necessarily a moment of happiness. And some of y'all heard me talk about happiness before, because there's the difference between happiness and joy. And I know you know this, but I'm going to say it anyway. That difference comes like this. Happiness is circumstantial. I always use the illustration that if I give you a piece of chocolate that makes you happy, it's circumstantial. But if as soon as I give it to you, before you even have a chance to unwrap it, I reach back and take it away, guess what? You're no longer happy. Because your happiness is a sense that's wrapped up in something that's happening to you. Joy, on the other hand, is something that comes from a totally different place. At some level, I believe joy is a gift from God. When we're obedient to God, then He instills this joy in us. But in the same breath, I have to acknowledge that in some great way, maybe even more than being a gift from God, joy is a choice that we make. Or maybe it's the product of the choices that we make. So here's a twist with this joy. Our choices play this huge part in producing joy in our lives. Now I want you to listen to some words from the Gospel of Luke, the 3rd chapter, beginning with the 7th verse. Now if you were here last week, you'll remember that we read the first part of the 3rd chapter of Luke last week, and where it's talking about John. It is introducing John the Baptist in his ministry, and it talks about prepare the way. It talks about making the hills level and all that kind of thing. So this is picking up right on the end of that, starting with the 7th verse from the Gospel of Luke, the 3rd chapter. John said to the crowds coming out to be baptized by him, "You brood of vipers, who warns you to flee from the coming wrath? Produce fruit in keeping with repentance. And do not begin to say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our father.' For I tell you that out of these stones God can raise up children for Abraham. The axe is already at the root of the trees, and every tree that does not produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the flame." "What should we do then?" the crowd asked. John answered, "Anyone who has 2 shirts should share with the one who has none. And anyone who has food should do the same." Even the tax collectors came to be baptized. "Teacher," they asked, "what should we do?" "Don't collect any more than you are required to," he told them. Then some soldiers asked, "And what should we do?" He replied, "Don't extort money and don't accuse people falsely. Be content with your pay." The people were waiting expectantly, and were all wondering in their hearts if John might possibly be the Messiah. John answered them all, I baptize you with water, but one who is more powerful than I will come, the straps of whose sandals I'm not worthy to untie. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. His winnowing fork is in his hand to clear his threshing floor and to gather the wheat into his barn. But he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. And with many other words, John exhorted the people and proclaimed the good news to them. Now, last week we talked about a little bit the preceding verses in this chapter, where Luke talks about that John's role was he was the one that was called to prepare the way. And remember, he references back to Old Testament prophecy, prepare the way of one who is coming. And he talked about that he'll make the hills level and the valleys, and make everything level and straighten out the roads and smooth everything out. Well, if you listen to John's words, it may not sound like a smoothing and leveling kind of word, does it? Talks about a brood of vipers and the axe being at the root. This doesn't sound like smoothing. This sounds like something that's making things incredibly more difficult. Not easy. Not making anybody, what? Happy. But what John is doing is setting up that there are a series of choices that we have to make if we want to operate and to receive this joy that comes from God. So it's about preparing the way, making those hills level. And that's what John came to do. Not that it would be easy, but that it would produce the joy of being able to come home. And that's acknowledging that there's a home that we have that's not of this world. Our home is in the presence of God. And so even in this life, we can begin to operate and experience in this joy that comes from knowing God. But we can only do that when we make the intentional choices to be faithful and obedient to God, to heed God's voice and respond. It's so clear that John's words lay out the hard work we have to do to come home to God. It says we have to produce fruit in keeping with repentance. In other words, he said, if you have 2 shirts, share with someone who has none. If you have food, share with someone who has none. Don't ask for more than you deserve. These are all, in some ways, things that make sense. But it's also, a lot of it is things that are out of our comfort zone and our normal way of life. Our normal way of life in our human existence is to take care of me. And part of what John is beginning to tell them is that to be operating and to live in this joy that God gives, you have to make intentional choices not to worry as much about you and to heed God's voice. If you do this, again, it's not easy or fun, but it will produce fruit. And that fruit is the joy of being able to come home and live our lives, even in this world, in God's presence. Advent is a moment where we should be focusing on getting realigned with the joy that comes from knowing God and experiencing that restoration, that opportunity to come home. I want you to hear some expressions of joy that Luke records in the verses leading up to Jesus' birth. Most of these are from the first chapter of Luke, and y'all probably know the whole story. You've heard it hundreds of times. You'll hear it again on Christmas Eve. But just hear some of the remarks that Luke records concerning joy. In the 14th verse of the first chapter, he says, "He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth." Talking about Jesus. On the 44th verse, "As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy." And y'all know that's Sarah talking about John. Even before he was born, he was declaring the presence of the Messiah. And then a little later in the 58th verse of the first chapter, "Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy." Keep in mind that even in these moments, Mary's existence was she was outside of wedlock, pregnant. She was pregnant with the Messiah, but all of the rest of society looked on her as a marked child. And then in the second chapter, the 10th verse, Luke records this, "But the angel said to them, 'Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people.'" Jesus is the source of that joy. As we anticipate the coming celebration of the birth of Jesus, our Savior, and our coming home, our real home, I pray we are intentional about putting ourselves in the way of joy. Putting ourselves in the way of Jesus. Won't you pray with me? Lord, as we gather in these moments anticipating the celebration that's to come, as we remember the birth of Jesus, who we know to be our Savior. Lord, help us be intentional with our choices about choosing to follow you, choosing to heed your instructions, choosing to live life as you desire us to live life. Lord, help us to move in ways so that we can begin to experience that joy that comes from being at home with you. Even now, in the midst of all the circumstances that go on in this world, we're designed to have tribulation, to have trouble. But we are not of this world. We are called to be of your world and to be at home with you. Help us, Lord, to live our lives in ways so that the joy that comes from being in relationship with you and being at home with you are obvious to those who see us in this world in which our bodies live. We pray these things in the strong and precious name of your Son, Jesus. And all God's children said,